the work that I'm going to focus on is essentially related to differential experiences across Jatis within the larger category of scheduled castes. Now, one valid question is, why scheduled caste? That is simply because we do not have significant amount of Jati level data collected across all the larger categories, and the census, on the other hand, collects and publishes data every 10 years on, until 2011, we have data on Jatis that belong to either scheduled caste or scheduled tribe category of that corresponding state. Now, in terms of what exactly do we look at when we say Jati level heterogeneity of experiences, there are two broad things in which we dive into. One is we try to look at the educational experience and how does that vary across different Jatis, and on the other hand we look into structural transformation and that experience, how does it translate into different Jatis. Essentially, there are two layers of the question. First layer, we are trying to understand how does the SC experience vary from the others or those who are non-SCs, and the second is how much of that experience translates into the experience of the Jatis that belong within the SCs. So coming to the first bit, which is on the educational convergence, what we find is that if I look at the broader constitutional categories, then across the Indian states, we do see that there is convergence up to the level of secondary education in terms of the states that had relatively lower share of educational levels in 1991 has increased and have some indication of catching up with the states that had relatively higher share of whatever level of education you look at, primary, secondary, literacy, etc. So therefore, there is a certain kind of catch-up that is happening if we look at SCs versus others across different states. What is not happening though is the moment we shift our focus from the larger constitutional categories of SCs versus others, if we just look at within SCs, one of the main and interesting finding on this note is that there is a very clear division in North versus South India. What we observe is in the southern states, the South Indian states, for most of them, we do see a Jati level convergence, which means Jatis that were relatively behind in 1991 in terms of share within the literates or primary or secondary educated have increased their share significantly, and there is a Jati level catch-up that happens, particularly up to secondary level of education. But this experience is only true for southern states. This experience does not translate even if you belong to the same Jati in a different state in northern India. It's most likely that there has been no catch-up, which essentially means that the earlier story that where I said up to the secondary level of education there is some kind of convergence that goes on, this when it comes to Jati level is true only for southern and not for the northern experience. In fact, if anything, we do not find much evidence of any kind of convergence. Whether you look at literate, whether you look at primary or secondary, there is no convergence going on at any of these levels of education across Jatis in the northern states. You might be wondering why I am talking about secondary and what happens after secondary. There is, whether you are in the south or the north, whether you are looking at Jati level or you are looking at SCs versus non-SCs, there is almost nowhere any kind of convergence in higher secondary education, which essentially, in fact, we find evidence of divergence. That means whichever state or whichever Jati in a given state were ahead in terms of their share within higher secondary has increased or improved their share, whereas those at a relatively lower share could not improve or increase in terms of their share in that particular category of higher secondary educated. So that is sort of the broad flavor of what we find in terms of the Jati level story on educational convergence. The second layer that we speak about in this report in a relatively with a relatively greater depth is when we are thinking of structural transformation. And we are talking about mainly two things: movement out of agricultural work and movement into non-agricultural work. There are first distinction that we have to sort of make, and this is something that we do pick up in the data itself, is that movement out of agriculture means very different things for SCs versus those who are not SCs. In case of SCs, and as we find in the report itself, in case of SCs, it is often movement out of agriculture is almost inevitably, almost in all states, is about movement out of agricultural labor, as opposed to for non-SCs, it is often movement out of cultivation. So the difference between cultivation and the difference and agricultural labor becomes key here in terms of understanding the importance of movement out of larger agricultural work. However, if we look at the within SC experience once again, what we find is that there is generally two levels of heterogeneity that comes in. One is the states differ in terms of the same jati might be experiencing very different outcomes across states in terms of moving out of agriculture. That is the first part of the story. And the second part is that whether in terms of moving out, are all the jatis moving out at the same rate between 1991 and 2011? The answer is largely no. No matter which state we are looking at, we are always observing that not all points of the distribution as it looks like in 1991 are shifting or changing in a similar rate, and therefore ending up with a different kind of distribution for 2011, which essentially leads us back to the question of, yes, it is important to look at differential outcomes across SCs and non-SCs, but there are multiple complicated factors that are coming into play, whether through the channel of education or through the historical land relations or through the channel of political mobilization. All of these things, there are multiple social complex factors that are coming together in order to shape the experience of structural transformation across jatis, even within a given state. Does that mean, based on whatever I have said so far, does that mean that the SC experience as a constitutional category, does it not translate anywhere within the jati experience? The answer to that is yes. And in fact, one of the striking figures that we find is that no matter which jati, no matter which state, what we find is that the increase in the construction sector that we typically know is, at least in the Indian context, heavily associated with heavy physical and manual labor. We see that it is almost in all states, in fact, not almost, in all states, we do find that jatis within SCs, every jati within SCs, their share in construction has gone up. Now, in certain cases, some jatis are, of course, relatively more, some jatis are relatively less, but if you compare 1991 and 2011 together, you will almost always see that there is a whole upward shift in the distribution of each jati across these states in the construction sector. So these are the few important findings related to jati that we find, whether in terms of educational or in terms of structural transformation, outcomes and experiences. So to sum it up, I think there are two large takeaways. One is, yes, there is significant historical, social and political factors that come together to shape the outcome of different jatis, and often it is very difficult to make generalizations about a certain group would be facing equal amount or an equal distribution of outcomes necessarily. That is negotiated. Whether that happens or not, that is negotiated through multiple social and historical factors. That's our first big takeaway. The second takeaway is actually more of a idea that unless we have a very systematic method of collecting information and presenting it for the sake of higher quantity of research, many people working on many dimensions to understand how exactly the dynamics of jati continues to be significant or important in the Indian context. So in short, we need much better data. It's a lot of challenge to work with jati level data, but I am sure that the policymakers and everyone would put some thought around the importance of jati level work and understanding jatis in a much more deeper manner than we presently do. So on that note, I would request all of you to check out this year's report, the State of Work in India 2023, as it deals with multiple issues of social identities and employment and structural change. And the report is available at our website at azimpremjiuniversity.edu.in. And I do hope that there will be vibrant discussions among the researcher community in general, and also to the extent possible with policymakers, everyone that has a stakeholding in the academic sphere or the policymaking sphere.